this is a book that I think I can recommend without reservation. I think the content is great, and the writing is beautiful. And for me, that really matters. I really like a book that's really well written. And I find that stirs me and it stirs my heart when I read it. And so I must have read this book many times. And I know people around me now in church, many people have read it many times. So to build it up anymore, it's How to Pray, a simple guide for ordinary people. I think, no, normal people. A simple guide for normal people. So if you consider yourself normal, this is a great guide for you. But it's just a wonderful book. I love it, and I think it's really impacted our church actually.
Well, I'd love to dive into it. I think my wife is reading it or has read it, and it's been sat on our
Yeah,
bookshelf somewhere, and I need to actually take the time to go and pick it out and read it.
yeah.
For those who've not read it, what does Pete Greig talk about? Well, I mean, obviously he's talking about prayer,
Yeah.
but in that, what's the kind of the point that he's wanting to get forward in the book? What's that kind of précis of the book?
Well, as many people probably know, Pete Greig was the founder of the 24/7 prayer movement, I think around 25 years ago now. And the starting point, he says, for the book was that when they started, the book, he says, has been written over the last 25 years, really, but just put on print about 5 years ago. He said prayer is pretty much the most important thing in life. And he realized at the start of that movement that he and his friends were incredibly bad at it. That's what he says. So he basically uses the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, and goes through that, um, pulling out different strands and different aspects of prayer and writing into them for each part. There's also a little story. I love that. There's little stories along the way. For example, for intercession, there's the story of Count Zinzendorf, talks about him and the Herrnhut community and the Moravians and so on. So he brings a story from history or from modern day. When he talks about unanswered prayer, he has a story from Joni Eareckson Tada, listening, Amy Carmichael, and so on. But it's just very accessible book. I think it sets you off on an adventure. For me, it really, I mean, I've always loved prayer, but it whetted my appetite again to go deeper. And, it doesn't go into great depth about any particular aspect of prayer, but just really, I think, like for me, with you talking about ice cream, sort of whets your appetite for going further and for having an adventure. And the fact that the prayer really is a great adventure with God, not just a you should sort of thing.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's sort of a little introduction to the book, but it basically goes through the Lord's Prayer, talks about, the simple rhythms. So he talks about some rhythms of life, praying like our Rabbi Jesus. He talks about pausing, how to be still before God. Many things that have become really important to me recently, and I didn't really realize that some of the root of it till I looked at this again for this podcast. I didn't realize that some of the root of it is actually in this book already, and maybe that's where it sort of kick-started for me, some of my recent exploration into spiritual formation and so on. And then he talks about adoration. So he says some beautiful things, actually. I wrote down a little quote from the book about that. He says, like an eagle soaring, a horse galloping, or a salmon leaping, worship is the thing that God designed you to do. So I just think that's beautiful. And that's what I mean by his language is great. He talks about waking up our souls, how we do that, how we pray a psalm, about using different types of music, about using tongues, speaking in tongues, which is great because some books about prayer and that they miss all that out. So he talks all about the gifts of the Spirit as well. And then he talks about asking, petition, intercession, perseverance, and unanswered prayer, and then about contemplation, like coming back to me and God and me, and then eventually, hopefully, getting to the point of where we can just be all God in a moment, for at least a moment. And then coming back to listening at the end and realizing it's all about, God initiates a conversation with us and we're to respond, as prayer is our response to that. And it's also listening to him. So
Yeah,
anyway, I probably said enough.
great. No, I mean, it sounds fantastically interesting. And I think for anyone, I think any Christian You know, I think that I don't think there's a Christian that thinks, oh yeah, I've got my prayer life, you know, sorted. You know, everyone needs to grow in it, just like everyone needs to grow in reading the word. And so I think this book sounds like it's a great benefit. You mentioned that it's been impactful for your church. How has that, what impact has that had, and what are some of those things that you've seen brought about by implementing some of these things?
Yeah, well, I mean, even just very recently, we're about to set up a prayer, what we're calling a prayer tent in the back of our main hall at church, just like a prayer space that people can book out to come and pray in. And we're actually thinking, well, on the wall behind, we're going to have the acronym that he uses in his book. So that's just a very recent example, which is PRAY. So that's pause, rejoice, ask, and yield. So we're going to have 4 big posters behind, and then with some words that will just incite people's and encourage people in knowing how we can go into a time of prayer and actually spend an hour in prayer, for example. So that's very recent. But I was thinking back to when I first read this book, and I remember it was in COVID time, actually. I think that's when it first came out, or just after that. And I remember all of us had a bit more space probably to read at that point. I read it, and I remember meeting with a group of people on Zoom, some of our younger leaders, and talking through it. And then also we went through something called the prayer course, which is linked to this book. So he's also done a course, which is, and in the book, he sort of links the chapters with the course. So how you can actually read the book and do the course at the same time, which is like a video-based course with discussion. So it's not a writing down sort of course, although they encourage you to do journaling and so on. So it's very good for people's self-education, if you like. I know quite a lot of our small groups, we have a list of, as well as doing notes about our weekly messages, which we send out to all our small groups after a Sunday. We also give people freedom in the groups to sometimes go off and do a different course or a different resource. So we have a folder of resources as well that we offer to people, and the prayer course is on that as well. For our young adults ministry, we're finding that our young adults are very, very passionate to pray, and it's really encouraging their passion for the presence of God. We're seeing a lot of young adults at the moment finding Jesus for the first time, and even from very beginnings of being Christians, they are like really wanting to connect with God, hungry to meet with him on their own and together. So that we're finding there's prayer groups springing up. We're finding that in our YA small groups, which people are very keen to get into the small groups, prayer has become an important part of that. And our YA gathering which is on a Monday night, they are actually studying prayer at the moment. So they've done a whole term, different speakers, different panels and discussions as well, and times of pressing into God together. So I would say across the church, this book has had an influence, even if it's more an influence in my life and David, my husband's life as well, and how that sort of like filtered down into the church as a whole.